Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Regenerative Agriculture panel. Hopefully people aren't feeling too sleepy after lunch. We've got a great lineup of panelists. We're first off going to start with some introductions. We've got Helen Crowley from Pollination, Tom Ludwig from Soil Heroes, and Dominic Strano from IDH Investment Management. Helen.
Hello, everybody. It's so good to see all of you here excited about regenerative agriculture. It is a fabulous topic to be talking about after lunch, so I hope the lunch has regenerated you. I don't know if it came from regenerative agriculture. That's a whole other topic. I'm Helen Crowley. I'm a partner at Pollination, which is a climate and nature advisory and investment company. Just full disclosure, I come from 10 years in corporate supply chains. Prior to that, working for a global luxury group, Caring. So it was very much focused on regenerative agriculture for sourcing fibers and materials. And prior to that, I was in conservation and development for 25 years. So on the front line of trying to work with smallholder producers to create regenerative outcomes. So very happy to be here with you and with my co-panelists to talk about this important topic. Thanks.
Thanks. Dominic.
Thank you. Good afternoon to all. Dominic Strano. I'm a director with IDH Investment Management. We're a Dutch-based organization, part of the broader IDH group. We manage the IDH Farm Fit Fund, which is a $100 million smallholder-focused investment fund. We're looking to catalyze commercial investors, retail investors, institutional investors into the smallholder agricultural space, and we realize that that's a scary step. So we look to take the junior position, take significant risk off the table, and by virtue of doing that, hope to crowd in other investors into the sector and try and close the significant gap that's required to increase food security and to allow smallholder farmers to really take their rightful place in the value chains. Thank you.
Thank you. And Tom.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tom Ludwig. I'm the Business Development Manager for Soil Heroes. We're an agricultural technology company on a mission to restore our soils. What we do is we measure and verify different types of environmental impacts, mainly on arable farms, and then we connect those regenerative farmers with people like yourselves, investors, companies, buyers who want to invest in that impact. We were founded by farmers circa 2018, so we were born from a regenerative farm just south of Rotterdam, actually, in Holland.
Great, thanks. So for those of you who just joined from lunch a bit late, this is the Regenerative Agriculture panel. I'm Jenny Hinman. I'm moderating today. I also have a background in regenerative agriculture and run a non-profit in the Peruvian Amazon called Plant Your Future, which works with smallholder farmers to restore degraded farmland using agroforestry. So to set the stage for this regenerative agricultural panel, I just wanted to talk momentarily about what intensive farming looks like. And I was lucky enough last weekend to come across this great book, which some of you probably read, Wilding, by Isabella Tree, The Return of Nature to a British Farm, on a friend's coffee table, and I promptly went out and bought it yesterday. So the introduction has just got some really sombering facts in it, which I wanted to share to set the stage today. So it says, changes in land use and intensive farming have altered the landscape beyond anything our great-grandparents would recognise. We're talking about the British context here. These changes have taken place at a scale in the landscape, at all scales in the landscape, from the size of fields that now cover entire valleys and hills to the almost total disappearance of native flowers and grasses from farmland. Chemical fertilizer and weed killers have eradicated common plants, from fumitory to scarlet pimpernel. Anyone who lives in the UK is probably quite familiar with this. But a few facts about the effects that intensive farming since in the post-war period has had. So since the beginning of the war to the early 1990s, we lost 75,000 miles of hedgerows. Similarly, 97% of our wildflower meadows have been lost since the war. The consequences of that have been absolutely catastrophic on wildlife. Insects and other invertebrates have been especially badly hit. They've more than halved since 1970. Moths have declined 88%, ground beetle by 72%, and butterflies by 76%. According to the RSPB, since 1966, we've lost 40 million birds from our skies. They have quite literally emptied. I think the whole thing is summed up quite well in this one line. She says, this is a story of unremitting unification and simplification, reducing the landscape to a large-scale patchwork of ryegrass, oilseed rape, and cereals, with undermanaged woods and remnant hedgerows the only remaining refuge for many species of wildflowers, insects, and songbirds. So I hope that sets the scene of what intensive agriculture is looking like in a British context. So let's move on to regenerative agriculture. Question number one. So regenerative agriculture is without doubt one of the most important opportunities of our time. Helen, can you start us off with a little bit about what this term means and how we can start scaling agriculture, regenerative agriculture globally?
Sure, thanks. Let me just start in a sort of in a general way, because I think what was highlighted, what Jenny just highlighted, is becoming really well recognised that the food system that we have, that our agriculture and food system is not addressing even food and nutritional needs, health and nutritional needs, and it is certainly contributing significantly to climate change and to biodiversity loss. It's one of the biggest drivers of biodiversity loss, so that was really highlighted. So when the system is really not working, we built this system based on certain outcomes, we have to rethink. We need new outcomes. We need health, we need nutritious food, we need systems that work, we need soil that functions, we need farmers that have livelihoods, and so on and so forth. And so the regenerative agriculture, and I don't want to get into definitions, and we can get into definitions if you want, and I know Tom has some thoughts on that too, but let's think of it as this transition away from this sort of destructive, these dry practices and this way of this system approach that we've got in place that is driving all these negative outcomes, to a place where we are restoring soil functionality. We are preserving livelihoods of farmers. We are increasing our health, our well-being, and our nutrition through these food systems. And it's doable because we know it's doable because it's been done for generations and generations, and it's getting done more and more all over the world now. So we see that we can do that. So I think when we think about regenerative agriculture, we do have to think there's best in class. There are fantastic regenerative systems out there, whether it be for wool or whether it be for coffee or whether it be for soy or you name it. There are great regenerative farming systems. But we do have to think about this as a transition as well, and we need to support this transition towards practices that restore health of people and soil, biodiversity above the soil, biodiversity below the soil. And I'll just leave it there to keep it sort of general because we can get into some details, but I would just say that we want to keep the tent big for the moment. There's a lot of debate and argument and healthy discussion about how do you define regenerative agriculture? What is it? Am I regenerative? Am I not regenerative? But we've got to all get on a pathway. So we should be looking at outcomes and measuring outcomes and say, yes, I'm getting better and better. My soil is getting better. My profitability is getting better. My health is getting better. That's what we need to start thinking about as we move to, and that's a regenerative system, restoring and regenerating nature.
Great, thanks, Helen. Dom, I don't know if you could chime in a little bit about how the context and approaches differ for regenerative agriculture between Global South and Global North.
Oh, sorry, me, I thought it was Tom.
Sorry, not Dominic.
No, not at all. I can't add any more to that in terms of a definition, absolutely not. But I think in terms of the Global South, it presents both a significant opportunity, but also a significant risk. And it's around the risk side that I think we really need to be focused. We look at smallholder farmers whose entire livelihood, risk of being tried, revolves around their farm. And if we're expecting them to adopt new practices and take the risk on regenerative agriculture, I think we need to be mindful in that. And notwithstanding the significant opportunities, benefits to climate resilience, reduction on the use of expensive inputs and water reduction, all those things being said, we do need to focus that change demonstrates or presents a risk. And how we address that risk, how we support farmers through that risk is something we need to consider.
Okay, great. Well, that kind of brings us on to our next question. Farmers obviously have to be at the center of these changes in agriculture. So Tom, maybe you can get us started on how do we go about incentivizing farmers to adopt regenerative agriculture? And I guess maybe more broadly, how can we start mainstreaming this approach?
Yeah, well, I think a couple of things come to mind. Firstly, we need to start paying farmers fairly for the impact that they produce on farm. As Helen has said, it needs to be focused on outcome. We can measure and verify that quite well now. There are different systems out there, like the Soil Heroes platform, but many others as well that can do that. And that demonstrates to farmers that there is an incentive there. There is value in the marketplace for these types of farming. So I think that's really important. Secondly, I think we need to get my notes. Sorry. We need to reduce the financial risk, as Dominic was saying as well. That's really important. So shouldering some of that financial risk at the start helps farmers overcome some of those initial hurdles. So things like investing in new machinery, investing in new types of seeds and crops can really help farmers to get moving in the right direction. And finally, I think we need to create a marketplace for produce that's being grown regeneratively. And that all comes down, I think, to effective storytelling and being able to show to farmers actually consumers are happy to pay a little bit more for these products and that they do value nutrition above quantity. So we move away from this focus that farmers currently have about yield, and actually start thinking about quality and nutrient density, as Helen was saying as well.
Yeah, great. Dominic, I don't know if you want to add a little bit on that in terms of incentives structures with smallholders for adopting regenerative agriculture.
I think many of Tom's points are echoed when you look at smallholder farmers, and I think it just needs to be, the incentives need to be more visible, and they need to be earlier, and they need to be clear. We can't expect farmers to invest on the promise of a return 5 years down the line. I think we need to make, as I said, we need to make the benefits very material and very clear from the start. And that's going to require a different approach to how we invest and how investors see returns, and necessarily for investors to take more risk up front and expect and benefit from the payoff later on down the line. So that's one way we see for smallholder farmers. It's slightly different than for larger commercial farmers who have the benefit of being able to either do this on a particular piece of land or do this off their own balance sheet. Smallholder farmers very often don't have that luxury.
Can I just jump in there? Yeah, I think there's an important perspective here. There's two perspectives that we've got to hold in our mind at the same time. There is the on-site, on-farm perspective of what is needed for those farmers who are now, we want to embrace as custodians of the land, of biodiversity, of soil, of people that produce so much of what we wear and eat. That we need to sort of think what is needed on the ground, right? And on the ground, there's a transition that's needed to help farmers move from one type of production system to another, and that involves technical assistance, and it involves machinery, it involves support, it involves insurance, it involves peer support too, because you don't want to be the only farmer out there doing something different to all your community around you. They all think you're mad, So you've got to have a lot of support for farmers as they transition to a new way of doing things. But I think there's the whole other perspective is the supply chain. I mean, farmers are producing products, materials, food and fibre for supply chains, and they're coming from sort of that corporate supply chain perspective. There's a lot of opportunity to use those supply chains as sort of, instead of to structure them appropriately so they do reward those outcomes, because companies want those outcomes. Companies want climate smart raw materials. Companies want raw materials that deliver livelihood benefits. Companies want raw materials that have embedded biodiversity value, even if they're not asking for that yet. They are heading that way. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to look at this also from a financial perspective. How does it work in the supply chain? How do we get that engaged to make this system work differently, as well as investing on the farm itself in what is needed? Yeah,
from my personal experience over the last few years working in this space, that speaking with companies, particularly food and beverage companies, they're now starting to focus their investment efforts rather than on offsetting projects, more on these insetting projects where they're actually working with farmers in their own supply chain to sequester and remove carbon internally rather than externally. And that, to me, seems to be a bit of a trend that I'm seeing in the marketplace at the moment of companies wanting to focus their efforts there.
Yeah, that takes us quite well into our next question, building on the insetting point. So some people say, though, that carbon's becoming too dominant a narrative when we talk about regenerative agriculture. It'd be interesting to hear your perspectives on that, whether it's an opportunity or a bit of a red herring. What other metrics and outcomes should we be focusing on to ensure sustainability and long-term viability beyond just carbon?
Well, yeah, I totally agree. I think carbon has definitely come to dominate the narrative over the last few years with regenerative farming. And actually, it's a very narrow lens to look at what is a fantastic opportunity and also a very complex ecosystem. So for us at Soil Heroes, we look at beyond carbon. We look at things like biodiversity, for example. I know it's been spoken about a lot today, both above ground and below ground. There's an awful lot of science now emerging around microbial health, and how that benefits crops and soil health overall. But also, I think that the key one that we haven't spoken about much today is around water storage, and actually demonstrating that regenerative farming improves the water storage capacity of our soils. And I think probably in the next 10 to 15 years, that's the conversation we're all going to be talking about, is water scarcity and how we're actually going to keep feeding ourselves through farming the way that we are at the moment. So water storage capacity is critical. And finally, as Helen mentioned earlier, nutrition and nutrient density. We can prove that healthier soils lead to healthier crops, more nutrient-dense crops. Then I think what more of a business case would you possibly need to invest in something like this? So let's try and move beyond the focus of carbon and think about some of those other co-benefits as well.
Yeah, did you want to?
No, please.
I just wanted to talk about the carbon as a pragmatic approach. I mean, we all should love. Let's be clear. Carbon is like really important. We're carbon life forms, and so carbon in the soil is really, really important. But as Tom said, it's about the functionality and it's about the outcomes that isn't just about carbon removal or avoided emissions. However, if at the moment, the way that you can start generating investable projects, revenues and support for this transition is in some way linked to carbon removals, sequestration or avoidance, then let's explore that, but not be so blinkered or siloed in the thinking that it is only about the methodology that tells me that I am sequestering more carbon or that I am removing carbon, but that is just a vehicle to support the broader system, and that those outcomes from the broader system, nutrition, farm profitability, biodiversity above ground and below ground, because remember, without biodiversity, soil is just dirt, right? It's the living bed in the soil that makes it function, that those are essential and imperative that are packaged with it. So I think we can be a bit pragmatic and say, okay, at the moment everyone's excited about paying for carbon credit insetting or offsetting. Let's explore that, but let's keep a very open systems approach that it's not only that we want. And so then that's really important, because when it comes to practices and what you actually do on the ground, it isn't just then about the carbon element, it's about also these other benefits. And so what you actually do on the farm is going to be determined. If you want that full co-benefits, you've got to do different things, right? You can't just be blinkered on carbon.
Yeah. And if we do just focus on carbon, we end up, I think, with a system of unintended consequences, which is from my experience in the soil carbon market. I'm talking to farmers who are saying, well, what about if I dig up my soil? Can I, start from scratch and have a lower soil carbon baseline? Well, no, that's not the system we're trying to work towards here. Or farmers will start focusing on planting crops purely for their carbon sequestration potential, rather than planting crops that we all need to feed ourselves. So we've got to be very careful, I think, about focusing purely on carbon in this space.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Dominic, it would be great to hear a little bit more about the way IDH has also been structuring its investment coalitions and using carbon finance along with other revenue streams to incentivize smallholders.
Certainly, and Helen mentioned the role that supply chain companies and off-takers and FMCG companies play in the sector, and I think they do play a critical role. But I think we also need to acknowledge their limitations. And so where we can play a role, where our fund can play a role, is really taking these risks off the balance sheet of the off-takers or the supply chain companies who are looking to make investments up or downstream. But we look at making investments that are bundled to this notion that we shouldn't just solely be looking at carbon. It's carbon, it's biodiversity, it's soil health, it's income diversification opportunities. It's also improving the underlying commodity or product that the farmer is supplying into that value chain. These are all elements that need to be considered when constructing an investment. And they won't all appeal to all investors. Individual elements will appeal to individual investors or off-takers or actors in the transaction. So you need to be able to structure the transaction so that if there's a coffee off-taker, they will have the focus on the coffee. But there might be then an intermediary that has interests in the carbon credits, or there's an element of biodiversity that can be attached to the transaction. So it's building the coalition around that value chain and then making sure that you have the investors in that transaction or syndicate that transaction such that it works for the individual investors and the timing works. So investors who have shorter horizons can take the shorter term exposure to, say, the working capital, and then investors who have longer time horizons can partake in the renovation rehabilitation aspect or the carbon sequestration aspect. We're looking at transactions now where we will pre-purchase the carbon credit, provide an income stream for the farmers to maintain the trees which are the subject of that credit, and as I said, make the incentive visible and immediate, and by doing that, try and incorporate an element or de-risk the element for the farmers, but also incentivize them sufficiently that it provides a material incentive for an investor down the line. We're looking at, I can't mention name, but a transaction in Vietnam with a coffee trader, a well-known coffee trader, who are specifically interested in the coffee, and the agroforestry program alongside that, which is providing the shade and the carbon credits, also provides an income diversification opportunity for the farmer. That portion is an interest to another investor, and so we just try and build a coalition around those transactions.
Great. Well, no, that's really, it's interesting to hear that example kind of explained. So I guess before we open up to questions from others, going back maybe to just thinking about those kind of slightly shocking facts I highlighted at the beginning about the effects of intensive agriculture just in the UK on wildlife loss, really like creating a biodiversity crisis here. How can we actually move, in the short term to a much more landscape approach to regenerative agriculture? Maybe Tom, you could start us off on that, because I know Soil Heroes is working in Northern Europe, so it's quite relevant to the kind of narrative in here. Like, what is actually needed to get this really scaled up? Like, is it even viable? We obviously switched to intensive farming for some reasons. Like, can we actually reverse that now?
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of exciting developments in the technology space, so remote sensing. I've spoken to a few geospatial companies that are here today, satellite monitoring, those kinds of things, which are fantastic. I do think it's important that we keep physical soil testing at the core of any kind of change. So I was helping some colleagues a few weeks ago with some soil tests in Hertfordshire. They're time consuming, but they're detailed analysis that we need to take to really establish a baseline. So I think there's a happy balance between tech and actual physical soil tests that we need to find. And also going back to one of Helen's points about knowledge as well. Farmers typically work in silos. It's a very hard industry to break into with new ideas. So if we can facilitate some kind of knowledge exchange between farmers as well, which I know your fund is helping with as well, Dom, I think that's a critical part of it as well. So some exciting developments with tech, but we also need to bring farmers along with us as well and make sure that they're learning from one another and sharing their insights, because it can be quite a lonely journey otherwise. Yeah,
I mean, I know there's people in the audience who are definitely looking for scalable investments in regenerative agriculture. Dominic, like another fact from me, I know we've got about 3 billion people globally who are rural, living across Africa, Latin America, and Asia. Many of those are smallholders. So that's like almost a third of the global population is basically living on smallholder farms. How can we scale up the kind of innovative models you were talking about in Vietnam to many more of these smallholder families? I think many of them have had no access to regenerative agriculture. Many of them are still on the frontiers of rainforest and so on. How can we get much more investment flowing in? Like, is that viable in the short term?
I think in the short term, probably not, because investment, as you mentioned, needs a certain scale. And the landscape approach is obviously ideal and provides sufficient scale. But to get there with regenerative agriculture becomes difficult for the reasons that Tom mentioned. That sort of at a technical level, how do you ensure that there are practices at a landscape level? So maybe if you look at issues of biodiversity and natural habitat protection, which are easier to then assess on a sort of landscape level using the technology that's now become available, soil moisture content as maybe a correlate or an indicator of soil health. Those become technologies that we need to layer in. But then you need a catalyst, you need a first mover who's willing to take significant risk to get the process rolling at a smallholder farmer level until it gains momentum or gains scale at a landscape level. And those are very difficult things to combine, and I think probably not realistic in the short term, but hopefully in sort of a 5-year horizon we'll get there.
Yeah, I just add that it's what type of finance, it's what type of money, okay, at what point in the process. So I think what we need to do is, it's an imperative, like we have to fix the agricultural problem, the challenge that we have, the problem that we have. It's an imperative for us. I mean, it's not like, oh, it's too difficult, I'll do it tomorrow. That's no. We need to do this for our survival. And so I think we've got to put all of our sort of thinking caps on and our creative, come to the table and say, okay, how do we make this work? How do we make this investable? How do we scale? Not is it scalable, but what do we need to do to scale it? And it's aggregation in smallholder situations and landscapes, aggregating across landscapes. And what type of financing and support can come in at that early stage? Is it development assistance? Is it philanthropic support? Is it some other type of financing that can come in, and then other financing? And you know all of this better than I, that there are different types of financing at different types of, along the project development timeline. And I think we just really have to solve this. It's not we can't just say, oh, it's too difficult with that many. Of those 3 billion, a lot of the rest of the world's food and fiber come from there. So it's like about those people, but it's about everyone. So apart from the obvious climate benefits and biodiversity benefits, and let's be very clear, there's resilience and adaptation benefits to doing regenerative, restorative approaches to land. It's huge benefits. I mean, so it's an imperative. So we've got to figure it out. So it's what type of financing, what are those blended finance approaches in different landscapes, in different countries and at different scales that we need to make this work, and we just have to make it work. And if it needs to be de-risked in certain ways, we figure out how to de-risk that and how to really get the outcomes that we need.
Okay, I think we're going to open up for some questions in the room, and for those of you online, hello. If you want to message in questions, apparently they will flash up on a screen here for us. So feel free to message in some questions. But in the meantime, has anyone in the room got a burning question? Yes. Microphone coming. Oh. Oops. Oh, sorry. I think they've taken it to someone else.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, and thanks to the panel. Very eloquently put. So my question is about, excuse me, I would say an elephant in the room, but as we've heard, there's not that sort of biodiversity here in Britain. So there is a structural issue here, of course, and it parallels the fossil fuel industry. I'd like the panel to speak to the problem of the structural issue of investment is blocked by the perverse incentives for farmers around things like agricultural inputs. It happens both in Britain and in where I work, in Tanzania. So that's a massive, massive sort of block in the road. So if you could talk about that a little bit, that would be interesting.
It's a big, it is the big elephant in the room that the subsidy scheme at the moment is totally dependent on the fossil fuel industry, and until we change that, it's going to be hard, I think, to start moving the needle. I think a way of sort of getting around that, and that's something we're trying to do at Soil Heroes, is create, I suppose, best-in-class case studies or inspirational partnerships between investors and farmers who can really shine the light forward for the rest of the industry. We can't rely on governments to change the subsidy scheme anytime soon. I think it is going to take time to untangle all of that. So I think the best opportunity we have at the moment is to at least make a start with regenerative farmers, with front-running farmers who could really pave the way forward for the rest of the industry. It's not perfect, but hopefully it will inspire others to follow suit.
Yeah, I just add, I mean, the repurposing of subsidies is an issue. The Convention on Biological Diversity is going through their consultations now for their Conference of Parties, and that's at the end of the year. It's been delayed, but it's turned out to be good. So it's like the COP, the biodiversity COP, as opposed to the climate COP, and those two are sort of talking more and more to each other. But repurposing subsidies, 1.8 trillion a year across all the different subsidies, I think it's 500 billion a year on agricultural subsidies, is a big topic. And there's some really interesting focus on that, like there's never been before, to the point of it is going to unlock scaling and so on. But just to echo what Tom said, I think our role, and the reason probably many of us are here in the room, is thinking ahead of the curve and trying to push the change that's needed, is to showcase this, is to have these light out, to show at a country level, that when you repurpose your subsidies, it's okay. The corporates will be there. There'll be support to buy your agricultural products, that are from this new system and so on. So I think we sort of have to really sort of be out there showing this and giving confidence that when let's hope it's like a flip, like that, but it's probably not going to be a flip. But when those subsidies can be repurposed appropriately, there'll be a lot of projects that can really get going fast because we've shown the way.
Okay, great, thank you. On to the next question.
I'm ashamed to say I hadn't heard of regenerative whatever until about 2 months ago. I just thought sustainable agriculture. So
bit of a rebrand.
Sorry again?
Just a rebrand of the term. It's just sustainable agriculture, really.
But it's, well, I mean, this is a very good point, is it? I mean, you can tell me. But thinking about soils, I mean, all the work that's been done on soil husbandry and the impact on yields, don't we now have a really good point in time where food supplies are threatened throughout the world? The governments, for political reasons, will want a better food supplies. I know there's a time lag between this and so that's really the question. Do you see this as a golden moment to push regenerative agriculture for the good of the people of Tanzania for a start and others?
Yeah, I mean, just in a European context, this could be where we are right now. I think is a real watershed moment, particularly with the Ukrainian crisis. We're seeing huge increases in fertilizer costs, for example. It's gone from about £300 a tonne to almost £900 a tonne. Farmers are really looking at their balance sheet, saying, "I've got to change how I look after my farm and how I manage my soils." So a shift to regenerative farming, where you're prioritising soil health, you're minimising soil disturbance, you're less dependent on artificial inputs, you're planting a diversity of crops, and integrating livestock wherever possible as well to help with that natural nutrient cycle, rather than importing it from Ukraine or Russia or wherever it might be. I think this could be a really good, as you say, a good golden opportunity to showcase what good regenerative farming looks like. So it's an exciting moment. We need to seize the bull by the horns. But I think hopefully there's people in this room here who are behind it and willing to take action.
Dominic and Helen, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Nothing more than we're also seeing significant increases in input costs for the farmers, and that there in itself is an opportunity to provide potentially an alternative to the question around the subsidies. it is about making alternative visible and material. And that's the only way we're going to try and move the needle. We can't undo the subsidy market. It's captured in many countries in which we work. And so it's unlikely that we're going to reportion it or position it to regenerative agriculture. The best we can do is provide a viable alternative. Yeah. And now is a really good time, as you mentioned, because it's become, input costs have gone up so significantly that the model for many farmers is blown up.
I mean, that's where regenerative farmers get their profitability pretty quickly, right?
Yeah.
Is the input, the cost, you know, your
Margins.
expenses go down so fast when you move to regenerative.
So less focus on yield, more focus on a margin basis. Yeah.
Okay, have we got any other questions from within the room?
One at the back.
Yes, hello, good afternoon, everybody. Adriana Nake, European Investment Bank. Really an interesting discussion. Indeed, we've talked a lot about farmers' interests, about value chain operators' demand, subsidy schemes. I was just wondering if you have examples of a typical or, a start of governance structure and financial structure of such investments that could be brought for scaling up. I mean, Dominic started already providing some examples, but I would appreciate if you can give some thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, so to give a British context, here in the UK at the moment, the agricultural bill has recently been passed, and farmers will start to be incentivized to implement some of these regenerative practices on their farms. So there's something called ELMS, which is the Environmental Land Management Scheme, where farmers will be paid, for example, to plant cover crops, to have green cover throughout the year, which sequesters carbon and helps with soil fertility. To have a basic soil management plan in place. So the government have set the bar pretty low in terms of their expectations, and it will be practice-based, but they're going to leave the market to determine the price for output and outcome. And so I think that's why everyone in this room can play their part in facilitating the transition, is paying for the outcome and the output. Government subsidies here in the UK will probably pay for practices, to replace the European Basic Payment Scheme, but the private market can incentivize output. Does that answer your question a little bit?
Yeah. If I may just complement, so I was thinking, if we have an investment proposal. Yeah, if we have an investment proposal, I mean, name it 50, 100 million euros, what kind of governance structure would you have? I mean, would you envisage? Is it a public-private partnership? Is it a fund investment? Is it a corporate level type of investment? Or, I mean, out of your experience? Thank you.
In our experience, you require a coalition, as I mentioned. So we would require, in our transaction, we require a project sponsor or the off-taker, somebody to risk share with us in that junior position. And we can take our fund can take a longer tenor, or provide equity investment for the establishment of a mill or whatever per se. There'd be a working capital requirement potentially, so that would be taken by a particular investor who would have a short-term focus. And then another investor, be ourselves, could provide equity as a risk buffer, but also then take a greater exposure on the longer-term tenor required. Then if you're looking at using a carbon financing instrument, ideally you would have an intermediary who does the verification, be the broker. The off-taker would have the interest in the underlying commodity, so they would then be able to either prepay or provide an incentive if it was using regenerative agriculture. So that would be another financing stream. And then traditionally we'd look at the fund manager to manage that coalition. I'm not sure if that's more along the lines of what you were thinking.
I think we've got one more question here, and then I think we're at time. So.
Okay, great. Go ahead, please.
Hi there. Thanks very much for that. Just to add complications on dynamics, you in agriculture have landlords and tenants. Landlords may have a different incentive or not to the tenant. You've got long leases, statutory renewals. So I just wondered if you had any views on the role that a landlord should play in this, and any useful examples of that dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously Global South, Global North probably quite different responses on that. I don't know. Tom, do you want
Yeah,
to jump in on
it's
this?
a really good question and something we're right in the thick of it at the moment, talking with farmers about. So I think here in the UK, a lot of land is tenanted. And, excuse me. I think as long as there's permission from the landlord for farmers to engage with these types of initiatives, these types of funds, that's the first step. Obviously, there's questions then around permanence. So if land's changing hands every 5 to 10 years, possibly, and investors put money into that, what's the longevity of that? How durable is that investment? Our hope is that once the farmers started on that regenerative journey and they start seeing what restoring soil health does to their margins, is doing to their yields, doing to the nutrient density of their crops, it would be folly for them to undo all of that good work and start from scratch. So hopefully the terms of a tenancy agreement become less of an issue once the farmers started on that regenerative journey. It's the best answer I can give at the moment, I'm afraid.
I think just to add on that, certainly from my experience with Plant Your Future in the Peruvian Amazon, obviously totally different context, but land titling is a huge barrier to scaling regenerative agriculture and lack of clarity over land title. And then if you want to bring in the carbon finance element, that can't be achieved until land titling is sorted out. And often there's a lot of corruption in the system and just bureaucracy in getting clarity on land title with regional governments and their systems for land titling. So I think certainly in an Amazon context, just getting clarity on title for smallholders or even for slightly larger landowners is really important in scaling up regenerative agriculture. And we've had no questions pop up online. I'm not sure if that's technical issues or just no one online's got any questions. But I think we're at time. Is that right? Yeah, we're at time. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much to the panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.